morning. Welcome to the Point. 1 week ago today, I was on my way to the Democratic Convention in Detroit. It is called an endorsement convention. It's where the members of the party get together and decide who they would like to have on the ballot for November on those races that won't be decided in a primary. Now, one of the biggest races that got the most attention was that of Attorney General, where Dana Nessel bested Grand Rapids' Pat Miles to win that endorsement from the Democrats. But there was another important race, too. Well, really not a race, because Jocelyn Benson had cleared the field, and she was the only nominee to become the candidate for Secretary of State. I sat down to talk with her about her views on the convention and what she would do if she was successful in being elected Secretary of State. Let's talk a little bit about this process, because it isn't every year that there's an endorsement convention, but Democrats have chosen to do that this year. You have received the endorsement moving forward for Secretary of State. What is the thought behind that process? Because like I say, it's not always happened.
I think it's a recognition of how important these offices are, Secretary of State, Attorney General, Supreme Court, and to give us as the party's endorsed candidates the opportunity to get out there now in the spring and talk to voters from all backgrounds about our vision and to go travel the state with the support of knowing that we will be on the ballot in November.
That's really important, because so often candidates end up in two really big races, and everybody says, well, the general is the important one. Well, it's not if you don't make the ballot in August. So, I mean, that becomes a very big race.
Yeah.
And those can also be debilitating for the party, because if you have two or more people on that primary ballot, campaigns get heated, things are said that can then carry over.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, the alternative to this spring endorsement convention is the nominating convention in late August.
Right.
And that still will happen. We still will have that nominating convention, just as the Republican Party will have to nominate their candidate. So again, this is just with the alternative being a long, drawn-out primary that could be potentially very fracturing within the party. This will hopefully get everyone on the same page early enough to move forward with a united front far ahead of the August nominating convention, when we'll formally be nominated and then go forward into the general.
It can be fracturing and it can be expensive, but let's talk about the matters at hand. There are few things in the performance of governance that people like me, the voters, take more seriously than our vote. Having a vote be private, having access to the ballot box, and all of the things that you and I talked about when you were here last fall. But let's talk a little bit again about that part of this job, because that's only a small part of it, but a very important part, particularly as we think about election security. What would you, if successful, what would you want to do to change the Secretary of State's office to increase both access and security?
Yeah, I think that's the duality of the role of the chief election officer of the state, to ensure we're doing everything we can to make voting convenient and accessible, but also secure. I mean, voters need to know that they can trust the results of the election to be an accurate reflection of the will of the people. And that's going to be one of my top priorities as Secretary of State, because we've seen, particularly in 2016, the potential threats to election security, and it comes with the machines. We need to make sure the machines are secure through post-election audits, which would be part one of my plan, to have immediate post-election audits in place so that we can know randomly testing machines to make sure that they're accurately counting our ballots. Secondly, we need to improve our poll worker training to make sure it's standardized across the state. So as every voter, no matter where you are, when you go into the polls, you have the same rules to apply across the board, and that poll workers are prepared to protect against any potential threats that may happen on election day. And then third, we need to protect the security of voters' data going into the election. When they register to vote, we need to ensure that that data is secure. But above all, we need to, with all of those three pieces in place, we need to make sure we're consistently staying ahead of emerging threats to our election security, because we know one thing is sure: the threats that we saw in the 2016 election did not start in 2016, and they will not end in 2016. And that means being prepared for every election, not just for the threats we know exist, but to stay ahead of potential bad actors and figure out what they're going to do before they do it and stop them in their tracks. So I will create a task force of the best and the brightest around the country who I've worked with at the national level doing this election work for over a decade. I will bring them to Michigan to help keep us advised on any new and emerging threats to the security of our election, so that we're always one step ahead of those threats.
I want to go back to something else you said, and I'm not taking in any way away from the security aspect, because that's very important. But you touched on something that immediately sparked a thought, and that is, you said better training for poll workers. That's no small task, because as the chief elections officer in the state, the Secretary of State is responsible in Lansing, but this is farmed out to city clerks, county clerks, township clerks, all across the state when it comes to an election. And so you're talking about a lot of polling places and a lot of poll workers. That could be a big undertaking.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I announced when I first announced my candidacy was this 30-minute guarantee. The idea you should be able to get in and out of a branch office and in and out of a polling place in 30 minutes or less. That kind of is my approach to all of this, that we should be able to standardize experiences so that no matter who you are, where you live, you have that same basic expectation of service from our government and same experience at the polling place. And that's why ensuring we have standardized poll worker training across the state is so important, working with the clerks in all 83 counties to ensure they've got the resources they need, but also that I'm an educator. My background as an educator, I was the dean of a law school in Detroit at Wayne State. So I approach this as saying, how can we standardize our education of our poll workers to make sure that the very good things that many of our clerks are doing to train poll workers well are being reflected across the state, and that support that some counties or localities may need to better recruit, train, and prepare their poll workers, we're providing that at the state level. For example, I want to ensure that every single poll worker, no matter where they are in the state, has to take a basic test before going into service as a poll worker. We don't do that now. We just train them and then send them off. Some localities do tests, some others don't. But as an educator, as the daughter of 2 teachers, I know the best way to ensure someone that we're training is prepared to do the job is to ask a few simple questions before putting them into work. And so that's one example of what we'll do to standardize how we're preparing and training our poll workers so that we are equalizing the voter experience across the state.
Voting, as I pointed out, is something that I think people take very, very seriously, and we've spent about half of our time together talking about that, and that may be appropriate because that's really only about half of the job when it comes to being Secretary of State in Michigan. We're one of very few states that within that office says, we want you to run our elections and do it well and keep the voter list straight and make sure everything's on the up and up. And oh, by the way, while you're doing that, we want you to handle license and registration, make sure people have insurance and all the other things that go along with it, because you also are what in many states would be a separate division called the DMV, or Department of Motor Vehicles, but the Secretary of State does it all here.
Yeah, it's one of the things that really excites me about this office, because this agency, more than any other, interacts with more citizens than any other agency in state government, whether it's driving or voting. And so we have a real opportunity not to just improve how those interactions are happening for our citizens, but in doing so really, I hope, reshape how state government interacts with its citizens. So if you have a good experience when you're going to renew your license, that can hopefully inform how you view all of state government, and also can show those others in state government, look, we've got to meet a higher standard here for our citizens. So I'm excited to embrace that role of the office of overseeing driver's licenses, overseeing drivers, how we train our drivers. Again, I'm the daughter of a driver's ed teacher, so I know how important it is that our young people are all equally being trained to prepare to be drivers in the state, and I want to take that role very seriously, improving our drivers' education support throughout the state and making sure that our licensing process is going well and that we're fighting any new fees. I mean, consistently we're seeing fees increase on our drivers in this state, and the roads aren't getting much better, as we know, and so there's no real even connection between the increase in drivers' fees and the increase in funding to our roads, and we need to ensure that we're blocking and stopping any new fees on drivers in our state until we come up with a plan to also improve our roads.
And in fairness, that is a legislative decision, not one made by the Secretary of State.
Yes, but as Secretary of State, I will be our state's chief advocate for voters and chief advocate for drivers, and I will make sure that every day I'm fighting any efforts to increase drivers' fees in our state, because I don't see them as being particularly helpful for where we need to be and for what's good for our drivers.
Also, not necessarily in the purview of the Secretary of State, but somebody who has to deal with it on a daily basis, is the cost of no-fault insurance.
Yeah.
We know that there are people, and in saying this, I'm not indicting anyone, because there could be a lot of reasons, but we know that there are people that get insurance for a day or a couple of days. They get their license renewed, and then they're driving around uninsured because some people are paying $6,000 or ridiculous amounts a year.
Yeah, I'm a resident of the city of Detroit, and I pay more insurance, higher insurance rates than not just most people in the state, but in the country. So one thing's very clear: our insurance rates are too high. There's something broken here in our system in Michigan, and it's one of the number one things I hear from citizens as I go everywhere in the state. What are we going to do to bring down those costs? And so I look forward to being an active ally for insurance reform in Lansing, making sure that we're recognizing that we're at the bottom of the barrel in Michigan compared to every other state with how much insurance our drivers are paying. There are many reasons why that is. Insurance reform is very complex and includes many different factors, but we've got to reform it because our drivers are paying too much.
As Secretary of State, if you were successful getting all the way through the process, and we're still early on in it, is that the kind of thing that you would personally take on and go to the legislature and say, look, you've been trying to do this now for, I can say conservatively, for the past 25 years that I've watched it, but it's been longer than that. They've been trying to come up with some type of a solution, and they always fall just that far short because you have all of these varied interests, and by the way, varied moneyed interests that come into the equation. Is that something you could take a lead on, or would that be politically devastating?
I intend to. I mean, my interest is in what's best for our drivers and what's best for our voters. And that's the advocate I'll be in Lansing for any legislative reforms I need to push for.
So as we move into this election cycle, nobody knows exactly what the feel will be in the air in November. It's still months away. But as you have been traveling around now, since at least last fall when we talked before, what kind of a sense do you get from people? Is there an anticipation about this election? Is there still dissatisfaction? Because even before the 2016 cycle, and maybe part of the manifestation of the 2016 cycle, a lot of people said they were just fed up with the government, period, and the way government was
I have
working.
seen, whether I'm in Macomb County or up in Marquette or Traverse City or Ludington or here in Grand Rapids, there's a consistent expression of extreme dissatisfaction with our government, a feeling that our government's not representing us, not listening to us, not effectively advocating on our behalf, but on, instead doing the work of others, sort of special interests or small groups. And all that, in my view, in Michigan, and particularly relates back to transparency and accountability in government. I mean, the Center for Public Integrity consistently ranks Michigan dead last among every other state for our transparency in government. And so that's one of my top issues that I want to advocate for and seek to change in Michigan, so that we know when money's pouring into our process, we as citizens know about it, we know where it's coming from. When people are lobbying our elected officials, we know who they are and where that money's coming from. All about providing our opportunities as citizens to be more informed and more engaged in the process, and that's something that citizens in other states have access to, and we don't here in Michigan.
There will be a primary election to select gubernatorial candidates in August, and a nominating convention that will solidify the endorsements that were handed out last week. And we'll have more to the point. Welcome back to the Point. In Lansing, the talk is all about budgets. In fact, over in the House, the Appropriations Committee has already dealt with their budget process, and the full body may be taking a look at them as soon as this week. We sat down with the Vice Chairman of Appropriations, Rob Verheulen from Walker, to talk about the process and what the priorities are when it comes to spending. As the Vice Chair of Appropriations, you are deeply involved in the budgeting process. Here we are, it's not even May yet, and all of the subcommittee committee work has been done, and all of the House budgets, including the school aid budget, are ready to be considered by the whole chamber. That's historically pretty quick, particularly when you look back to 10 years ago today. We were in the throes of another year when we were going to come to a near government shutdown, but things have changed a lot, haven't they?
Very, very much so, and I think it's a positive development. I constantly say budgets don't get any easier with time. Make the tough decisions and move on, do it in a business-like fashion. We've had countless hours of testimony in all the various subcommittees, and I think it's a good budget. I think I think next week we're going to try to put it on the House floor, and I'm confident that the budget will pass next week in the House. And then, of course, we have to wait until the May revenue sharing estimate or revenue estimating conference so that we know that the assumptions we make on revenue and so forth are valid. But then I'm confident we're going to wrap it up. I talked to the approach chair in the Senate this morning, and they're slightly behind us, but they're on track as well. So I'm feeling very good about the process.
In fairness, when there's money coming in, it makes it a lot easier to set a budget. So when I referenced 10 years ago, we were right in the middle of a great recession, and the revenues for the state were way down. A whole lot of us weren't working or weren't working at the level we had been. So there were a lot of different things, but there is also a process that you kind of pull some of these budgets together when you look at them. I mean, you kind of do the whole budgeting process, and you guys are taking a look forward as you do these budgets. So when you were doing this last year, you had some guess of what might happen this year. I mean,
oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes. If there's a major shift in income, depression, recession, that has an impact. But generally speaking, we know where we are. We've done a lot of the work. The Appropriations Committee in the House, this is the second time around for the freshmen. So they know those budgets. They know what a lot of the discussions that took place last year. So I think it's easier the second year in a term than in the first.
Let's talk about where our priorities are, because if where we spend money sets the priorities of the state. Let's start with that school aid budget. That's always a point of contention. There are always people that believe there should be more money, but there are also those who say we've got to live up to the responsibility of retirement expenses and those kind of things, and that sometimes creates a little bit of a loggerhead. Where are we there as it stands in the House? Understanding it'll have to be reconciled with the Senate.
I think it's a good budget. It's about $14.8 billion, the school aid budget. It's up 1.6%. We increased the foundation allowance by about $312 million, and it's the largest foundation allowance, the largest increase in the past 15 years. Just so happened last night I was at an event with public education administrators and school board members, and I was working the room, and I was asking them, what do you think of the budget we did? And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they said, yeah, we would, on the margins, would tweak it here or tweak it there, but overall they were quite pleased, and I'm pleased. I think education, the schools are one of our big priorities when you look at this budget overall.
I wrote a piece recently in preparation for the Detroit Chamber's policy conference on Mackinac, and a couple of the things I talked about were education, K through 12, and then the next step, skilled trades and higher education. With skilled trades, is there money in this budget to expand that kind of training that the governor has talked about? I know he's talked about his Marshall Plan, but people on both sides of the aisle seem interested in giving alternatives to perhaps a 4-year degree.
Yes, there is money, and I think that's a concept that is across the political spectrum. People are very supportive of that, giving our young people alternatives. And as the governor has said many times, there are a lot of very high-paying skilled trade jobs that are not filled. So we're seeing the K-12 system and the community college system in particular training those young people for very good jobs. One
of the questions, and I admit having a bit of a bias, is I have 2 sons that will at some point likely be going to either one of those schools or a 4-year university, and the cost of higher education continues to rise. And the fact is that the percentage paid by tuition versus the state has just become inverse over the past 30 perhaps years. So no matter what happens from a budgetary standpoint, it's probably not going to have a big impact, but I assume in this process you discussed the costs of 4-year colleges and what you could do to help mitigate that.
Yeah, we did, and we increased funding for the 4-year colleges, but you're absolutely right. If you go back over 25 years, in real simple terms, 25, 30 years ago, 80% of the funding for our 15 public universities was coming from state appropriations. Today it's 20% or less. And of course the gap is made primarily through tuition, so it's on the back of our students. And this morning I was making the same point, and this happened to be a father of a college student. He says, well, it's tuition, it's not totally the students, it's also their parents. So it has a big impact, and certainly the public universities are concerned about that. But we are increasing funding for the 15 public universities, and it's going to be a continuing problem, and I don't see a short-term reversal of that trend. I think we can maybe hold the place, but we're not going to be, I can't see in the next few years 80% of the funding for the public universities coming from state appropriations.
It's speculative, of course, but it is an interesting concept that if indeed the state is successful and the community colleges and high schools are successful in training people for good wages, for jobs that pay well, without four-year universities, if that puts pressure on those institutions to become more competitive, if for 2 years I can do something that costs maybe 25% of a four-year college, but as I say, that's speculative. We'll have to see how that plays out.
But I think it's an incredible opportunity, and it gives options to these students. And I happen to be the product of a four-year university, but that isn't for everyone. And there are opportunities, and I think it's important for us as a state to encourage making those options available, and I think it's good for the student, it's good for the state.
I want to move on pretty quickly because we always start running out of time too soon, but let's talk about one other big line item, and let me just start by saying the vast majority of the people watching this program will say that's not enough. Roads, bridges, infrastructure in general. We know what the plan is to get up to $1.2 billion in the coming cycles, but where did we come out in this budget?
In this budget, it's a $4.3 billion. It's up about $193 million, which is about a 4.5% increase. So it's certainly a positive step in the right direction. Is it going to fix the roads? I think anyone who tells you that is not being candid, not being honest. So, and we have budgeted, or we have plans to increase the general fund contributions to that budget in the future, and that will be for a future legislature. But I think it's a very positive step. I kind of look at the budget as being schools, roads, and public safety. We've increased, I think, Trooper School 130. We put in one of my budgets, we've increased the OK to Say in the schools for anonymous reporting of bullying, assaultive behavior, and so forth in the schools. So I think those are the three areas that we've really made a positive step.
One of the areas that I think you would consider public safety is something touches very near your district, and that is the contamination of water with PFAS. And before we get too far down that road, I should point out that it is the opinion of many that PFAS is one issue, but there may be any number of other emerging contaminants that, as you and I said here today, we don't know about, but 50 years ago, somebody dumped something somewhere that they didn't think was a problem, and it may become one. It's a universal problem in that it is global, but for Michigan, and particularly for those of us in Kent County, this is a very backyard problem. How does this budget, if it does, address that? There's already, I should say that you passed a supplemental back in December for about $23 million, if memory serves.
Right, and there is additional money in this budget, which for the fiscal year beginning October 1st. I don't know that we actually have I don't believe we do have our arms around exactly what the impact of this is going to be. We are still discovering new sites. DEQ is out there. We're getting reports from all over, and they're doing the testing, and they're finding new sources or new sites of contamination. And we're going to have a long, hard discussion on what is the role of state government to mitigate that. In Kent County, Wolverine has been funding a lot of the remediation, but there are sites where we either don't know what entity was the source of the pollution, or they don't exist anymore, because 20 years ago when this dumping was occurring, it might have been perfectly legal, and they go out of business, and here we are. So is it a state responsibility? What is the role of the federal EPA? And I think we need a lot more science.
As the representative said, the Senate is dealing with their budget process too. Expect it all to be wrapped up sometime late May or early June. And we'll be back with more To the Point. Well, election season is upon us, and there will be a lot to talk about every Sunday morning. That's why I hope you'll join us at 10 o'clock for To the Point.